Okay, good morning. We are on day 14 of our Persuasion Book, and we're talking about mass delusions. This is our book by Scott Adams called Win Bigly. If you don't know how frequently mass delusions occur in your daily experience, many of your opinions about the world are likely to be nonsense. That's because mass delusions are the norm for humanity, not the exception. Don't believe me? Oh, he keeps running away. I don't think he likes the book as much as I thought he did. Gotta chase him down. Oh, where's he going? Ha. You're trapped. You have to read with us. Come on. People aren't here to see me. They want to see you, baby. All right, we'll look at his back. Backside. Part of this. Okay, so don't believe me? It is easy to check. Just ask your neighbors about their religious and political views. You'll find plenty of disagreement with your worldview. And so according to you, your neighbors and all the people who agree with them must be living in some sort of hallucination. How can they believe they are reincarnated when you know that death means either heaven or hell? You and your neighbor can't both be right. Or one of you, at least, is experiencing a little piece of larger mass delusion. And the problem isn't limited to your neighbors. Millions of people share the same mass delusions, according to you. Do you remember when millions of Americans believed President Obama was a secret Muslim? That was a mass delusion. Obama was a secret Muslim. No. Do you remember when President Trump got elected and there were protests in the street because they thought he was the next Hitler? That was a mass delusion. Do you remember the dot-com bubble? That was based on mass delusions about the value of money losing startups. Every other financial bubble was also a mass delusion. Below is a starter list of the more notable mass delusions from Wikipedia. Lists over 30 examples of mass hysteria through the years, but those are only the famous cases. Mass delusions are influencing every one of us all the time. Until the spell is broken, you can't tell you are in one. The examples that follow should be enough for you to see the pattern. Once you see how easily mass delusions start and how confirmation bias can keep them fueled, you might start to recognize how often it is happening to you in your daily experience. Salem witch trials. Between 1692 and 1693, authorities executed 20 people in Salem, Massachusetts for being witches. This is perhaps the most famous case of mass hysteria in American history. It all started when 4 adolescent girls started having fits that didn't have an obvious cause. In this sort of situation, all it takes is one idiot to suggest witchcraft is the problem, and from that point on, confirmation bias does the rest. Once your brain filter is set to look for witches, all evidence fits into the witch frame. Orson Welles' The War of Worlds. In 1938, author Orson Welles broadcast a radio adaptation of H.G. Wells' book, The War of the Worlds. People who missed the introduction and tuned in late believed they were hearing a new report of an actual alien invasion of Earth. This is a rare case of a double mass delusion. The first mass delusion involved listeners misinterpreting the radio program as a news report and believing space aliens were attacking. But that mass delusion didn't influence many people because the radio show had a small audience. The second mass delusion is that this story was exaggerated in the telling until the public believed it had been a mass delusion of national scale. I can confirm that When I was a child, I learned from my parents that the radio program fooled much of the country at the same time. That didn't happen. The program had a small listener base, and anyone who heard the introduction knew it was presented as fiction. McMartin preschool trial. In the 1980s, the operation of a preschool in Manhattan Beach, California, the operators were arrested on charges of abusing 360 kids. The accused were found not guilty on all charges. Later, we learned that investigators used an extremely aggressive, suggestive form of questioning when interviewing the children. The kids made up all sorts of stories in response to how the questions were planned. None of the stories were true. I learned in hypnosis class that kids are more suggestible than adults. Anyone with my kind of training would have seen this situation for what it was. By the end of this book, you'll be able to do the same. That's why we're reading it. Tulip mania. In 1637, the Dutch became so enamored with tulips, a flower that was new to them, that they bid up the price of tulip bulbs, the part you plant, to about 10 times the annual income of a skilled worker. Everyone understood that the plants were not intrinsically valuable, but as long as people believed the next sucker would buy a bulb for more than that last sucker paid, the price continued to climb. Like all financial bubbles, eventually it popped. On top of our mass delusions, we also have junk science that is too often masquerading as the real thing, to the extent that people can't tell the difference. That too is a source of mass delusion. In the 2D view of the world, mass delusions are rare and newsworthy. But to trained persuaders in the third dimension, mass delusions are the norm. They are everywhere and they influence every person. This difference in training and experience can explain why people disagree on some of the big issues of the day. For example, consider the case of global warming. People from the 2D world assume mass delusions are rare, and they apply that assumption to every topic. So when they notice that most scientists are on the same side, that observation is persuasive to them. A reasonable person wants to be on the same side with the smartest people who understand the topic. That makes sense, right? But people who live in the 3D world where persuasion rules can often have a different view of climate change because we see mass delusion, even among experts, as normal and routine. My starting bias for this topic is that scientists could easily be wrong about the horrors of climate change, even in the context of repeated experiments and peer review. Whenever you see a situation with complicated prediction models, you also have lots of room for bias to masquerade as reason. Just tweak the assumptions and you can get any outcome you want. Now, add to that situation the fact that scientists oppose the climate change consensus, have a high degree of career and reputation's risk. That's the perfect setup for a mass delusion. You only need these two conditions. Number one, complicated prediction models with lots of assumptions. Number two, financial and psychological pressure to agree with the consensus. In the 2D world, the scientific method and peer review squeeze out the bias over time. But in the 3D world, the scientific method can't detect bias when nearly everyone, including the peer reviewers, shares the same mass delusion. I'm not a scientist, and I have no way to validate the accuracy of the climate model predictions. But if the majority of experts on this topic turn out to be having a mass hallucination, I would consider that an ordinary situation. In my reality, this would be routine, if not expected, whenever there are complicated prediction models involved. That's because I see the world as bristling with mass delusions. I don't see mass delusions as rare. When non-scientists take sides with climate scientists, they often think they are being supporters of science. The reality is that non-scientists are not involved in science or anything like it. They are taking the word of scientists. In the 2D world, that makes perfect sense because it seems as if thousands of experts can't be wrong. But in the 3D world, I accept that the experts could be right, and perhaps they are, but it would be normal and natural in my experience if the vast majority of climate scientists were experiencing a shared hallucination. To be clear, I am not saying the majority of scientists are wrong about climate science. I'm making the narrow point that it would be normal and natural for the group of people to be experiencing a mass hallucination that is consistent with their financial and psychological incentives. The scientific method and the peer review process wouldn't necessarily catch a mass delusion during any specific window of time. With science, you never know if you are halfway to the truth or already there. Sometimes it looks the same. Climate science is a polarizing topic, ironically. So let me generalize the point to say that compared with the average citizen, trained persuaders are less impressed by experts. To put it another way, if an ordinary idiot doubts a scientific truth, the most likely explanation for that situation is that the idiot is wrong. But if a trained persuader calls BS on a scientific truth, pay attention. Do you remember when Citizen Trump once tweeted that climate change was a hoax for the benefit of China? It sounded crazy to most of the world. Then we learned that the centerpiece of politics around climate change, the Paris Climate Accord, was hugely expensive for the United States and almost entirely useless for lowering temperatures. Experts agree on both points now. The accord was a good deal for China in the sense that it would impede its biggest business rival, the United States, while costing China nothing for years. You could say Trump was wrong to call climate change a hoax, but in the context of Trump's normal hyperbole, it wasn't as wrong as the public's mass delusion believed it to be at the time. I'll conclude that Citizen Trump did not understand the science of climate change. That's true of most of us, but he still detected a fraud from a distance. It wasn't luck. All right, so that was the end for today. Next time we will go to When Reality Bifurcated. So that's going to be on page 67. All right, thanks. Comment, like, subscribe. See you tomorrow.